All right, hello and welcome to our beef educational video series. My name is Maggie Daly. I am the Education and Industry Relations Director for the Indiana Beef Council. And today I will be going over a couple different topics for some of your consumer beef information. What we'll be going over is some of your different cuts of beef, some different cooking methods. This is going to be part of your video 1. Then we will also go over some of your consumer beef basics and food safety. That'll be more of your video 2. And we will also go over some great nutritional information also. Now, and also you can also catch a video of me doing a quick cooking demonstration that I will normally be including into my presentations when visiting schools. Now we are going to start off with your #1 selling beef item, which is your ground beef. Now that is like in your burgers and tacos and chili. It is an extremely versatile item and you can use it in just about any way you can think of. You can cook it in just about any way that you can think of. Again, it is your #1 selling item, generally what you're going to see the most commonly. It's also going to be one of your more affordable beef items. Now your different types of ground beef are going to go to more of a lean to fat ratio. So what that means is exactly what it sounds like, it's your meat to fat. Now if you are looking at a package of ground beef from like your grocery store, you're generally going to see 2 numbers on that packaging. You're going to see a larger number and a smaller number. That larger number is going to be your meat or your lean content, while that smaller number is going to be your fat content. Most commonly you're going to find them in the categories of 70-30, 80-20, and 90-10. Now your 70-30 is going to be your cheaper of your cuts. It's going to have your most amount of fat. So what that means is once you actually go to cook that ground beef, it's going to shrink up the most because that fat is what's going to melt. It's going to turn into grease at the bottom of your pan, leaving the meat and lean content. So that's part of the reason why it's going to be your cheaper of the 3. It's leaving you with the least amount of that meat content afterwards. So you really want to use it for recipes where you can drain that fat away beforehand, before adding it into your recipe or from consuming it. Now, 80-20 is going to be a little leaner, generally a little bit more expensive. So when you're cooking it, it's going to have less fat, less grease at the bottom of your pan. It's also going to hold together really well. It's going to have a really nice balance of meat to fat to really help hold its shape. So it's really good for recipes where you want that ground beef to hold its shape. Meatloaf is a good example, Salisbury steak's another example. But any kind of recipe where you want that ground beef to hold together, 80-20 is a good way to go. 90-10 is going to be your most expensive of your cuts of your ground beef because again it's going to leave you with the most amount of your meat or your lean content. Gonna have very little fat drain away once you are cooking it and leaving you with a good amount of meat or lean content. Now also since it has the least amount of fat, that means it's usually going to crumble up a little bit more than your 80-20 because it doesn't really have that fat to help bind it together. And it's not going to have as much juices caused by that fat as well. But it is going to work well for recipes where maybe you can't drain that fat away beforehand. Maybe you're making like a stuffed pepper or stuffed cabbage and you just want to put it in there and throw it in the oven and you don't have to worry about a bunch of excess grease inside of that recipe. So that 90-10 is going to be your best way to go. Now, you want to cook your ground beef to at least 160 degrees. This is going to be the magic number in which you're going to kill all of your bacteria. Now, while you're cooking, you're going to notice that it's going to start turning to a nice brown color. And the more you're cooking it, if you're crumbling it up for a recipe, for like a sauce or for chili, for example, the more you're crumbling it up, the more you're going to see that it's brown all the way through. Now, if you're making something where you can't see in the middle of it, a good example is going to be like your burger or like your meatloaf. You can always use a meat thermometer to make sure you're getting that good internal temperature of at least 160 degrees. Now, you can use those or more of your dial meat thermometers. There's also digital meat thermometers that you can use, but you want to make sure you're getting it down into the middle and the thickest part of that ground beef to make sure you're getting a good read and getting that good internal temperature. Now, generally you're going to notice that if you're making this and you don't have a meat thermometer, what you can do while you're cooking your burger, for example, is you can take your spatula or your tongs and just press down the middle of that burger. If the juices come up pink, that generally means there's still some pink in the middle. That generally means you need to cook it a little bit longer. If you press down and the juices come up clear, that means the inside of that is clear. That means you're good to go. Now, question we get quite often about raw or uncooked ground beef is when you get that ground beef from a grocery store, for example, and you open up the packaging, you haven't cooked it yet, you notice that it has kind of a two-tone color. Maybe kind of a brighter red color on the outside, kind of a darker color in the middle. Now why is that? What causes that? Some people have thought that they're mixing old ground beef with new ground beef, or they're adding colorants or dyes in there to give it that two different color. What it's actually caused is oxygen. That oxygen being exposed to the outside causes a blooming or oxidation effect, giving it that kind of two-tone color. Now, moving on to steaks. Steaks are generally considered your best tasting of your beef cuts. Now, they are also very easy to prepare. You can cook them pretty much any way you can think of. Grilling, broiling, and frying are going to be some of your most common, considered some of your top ways of preparation. Now, they are considered more of a special occasion cut because they can get a little bit more on the pricey side. But a little bit about what are we talking about is some of the differences in your cuts and what can cause some of those price differences. Now, premium steaks, these are generally what you think of when you think of steak. These are going to be your higher dollar, considered your higher quality of your steaks. Now, it's going to be like your filet mignon, your ribeye, your T-bone, your porterhouse. Now, what makes these steaks premium, what generally gives them that higher price tag, is actually going to go back to where the majority of these cuts are located on the animal's body. You're going to find the majority of your premium steaks in that rib, short loin, and sirloin, right in that back middle section of the animal. Now, what makes the difference between these cuts and some of your other cuts is really going to come down to the tenderness and the marbling. So marbling is going to be your little flecks and streaks of fat going through the meat and the muscling itself. When you cook that cut with a lot of good marbling, that marbling is going to melt and become your juices and your flavor. Now, tenderness is going to be more of your softness of your meat. So these cuts in particular are going to be more tender due to the fact that cattle have a harder time exercising that back middle portion of their body. There's a whole lot of rib bone going right through there. You can't really drop down and start doing crunches. Now, tips for making that perfect steak. Cooking time generally has to deal with the thickness of the steak. The thicker the steak, longer the cooking time. You generally could add or subtract a couple minutes of time depending on the thickness of that steak. Now, generally you want to season your steaks with a rub or a marinade. Now, keeping in mind some cuts of steak do better with either or. Good example of that is going to be some of your tougher, some of your cheaper cuts of steak. Generally, steak's not considered to be in that premium steak cut area. A good example, that's going to be like your flank steak. So if you have a flank steak and you use a marinade with a tenderizing component, what that generally means is more of an acidic component. It's actually going to help break down some of those tougher connective tissues the longer you leave it in that marinade. Help give you that juicier, more tender final product. Now, you generally want to cook your steaks over medium to medium high heat. This is going to make sure you get that good, consistent cook throughout. Now, using a tongue, not a fork to turn, this is on your traditional grill or skillet. So the reason behind that is when that steak is cooking, the juices inside of it are bubbling and cooking as well. So if you pierce the outside of that steak, you run the risk of losing some of those juices and ending up with maybe just a slightly drier, slightly less flavorful steak. Now, a good rule of thumb, steaks that are a ½ inch thick, some of your thinner cuts of steaks, you really want to just turn once on your traditional grill or skillet. While your thicker cuts, your 3/4 to a full inch, you might want to add a couple turns in there to make sure you're getting a good, consistent cook throughout. Now, you also don't want to overcook your steaks. Much like vegetables, you can actually cook some of the nutrients out of steak, and as well as cooking some of the juices out of the steak. Now, a good way to check the cook is, again, using that meat thermometer. Again, making sure to get it through the thickest point of that steak so you can get that good internal temperature. Generally, they suggest a medium to medium rare cook to help retain a lot of your good juices and a lot of good flavor. Now your medium rare is going to be around 145 degrees in the middle, while your medium is going to be right around that 160 degrees. But of course you can judge visually once you're done cooking, and taking a look at the inside color of that steak and looking down and more of that left-hand corner, that darker pink is going to be more of your medium rare, while that lighter pink up top is going to generally be more of your medium. Now, moving on to pot roast. Now, these are considered a really great comfort food, considered kind of a cooler weather food, more of your holiday season food. I like them all year round, but that's generally what they are considered. Now, they are still very versatile, and they work great in those stews and those chilies, those really good warm-up kind of meals. Now, they are also an excellent value. You can get a whole lot of pot roast for the same price, if not cheaper than your premium steak, so you get a lot of bang for your buck with your pot roast. Now, they do require a moist heat cooking or braising. Now, the reason behind that goes back to where a lot of these cuts are located on the animal's body. You're going to find the majority of your roast cuts in your chuck and your round. That's around the shoulders and the back end of that animal. Now, this is where they're getting all their exercise. When you exercise, your muscles tighten and harden, connective tissues and muscles tighten. Same thing goes for cattle. That's why those cuts in particular need that slower heat, that nice moist heat, that braising. It's to really help break down those tougher connective tissues to give you that really nice fall apart, really flavorful steak, really flavorful pot roast. All right, these are going to be some of your more common of your roast cuts. Again, you can see the chuck, the round. Now there are going to be some differences between these cuts. Your chuck cuts are generally going to be just a little bit more tender, have more of that marbling and that fat in them, while your round cuts are generally going to be quite a bit leaner. Now again, they both do well with that great, nice, slow, moist heat. That brisket, same way, it's going to be in that middle lower chest area of that animal. Now, moist heat or braising a tightly covered pan, again, that's like your slow cooker, your pressure cooker. You can do it in your oven as well, as long as a good heavy pan with a nice lid. Now, whatever liquid you use will generally be in your recipe. However, if you're just winging it, I always like to use a nice broth or soup to add a really nice depth of flavor in there. Now, another tip people will generally use when cooking their roast, they will actually sear their roasts in a pan beforehand. This is to add a really nice depth of flavor and help give you some nice texture to that roast as well, to the outside of that roast. Now, if you're doing it in the oven, a good average cook time as well as heat is about 2 to 3 hours at 325 in the oven. Now keep in mind this could change depending on the size and the weight of your roast. You really want to pay attention to that. That can even add or subtract to your cooking times. Now you can use those juices afterwards to create a gravy or an au jus, anything to really add to your meal. You generally want to serve them in chunks or sliced across the grain. So the grain of your meat is caused by the striation of the muscle. If you look closely at a lot of your roast cuts, you'll notice the little lines going down those cuts. That is going to be the grain of your meat. It's pretty simple to tell when most pot roasts are done. Generally all you have to do is you take 2 forks, take the largest chunk of the roast you have in your pot, and pull it apart. If it pulls apart very easily, you're generally pretty good to go. Now, if it has a little bit more resistance, you have a tougher time pulling that apart, you may want to cook it just a little bit longer, make sure you're getting that nice fall apart roast. And that concludes our volume 1 for our beef educational video series. We'll see you for the next one.